Feeding our babies is supposed to come naturally. We see images of cooing babies and smiling moms and doting grandmas and expect that to be us. We don't see all the struggle that goes into every decision that seems so high stakes at the time. We don't expect all the leaking, the engorgement, the deciding to take a break. We don't expect all the judgment, whether we breastfeed or bottle feed or pump or don't. Or maybe we do expect all those things and it comes smooth sailing. But what I have encountered as a doula, a childbirth educator, and a lactation professional is that when I tell people what I do, the stories flow out naturally. And I love hearing them. I hope you do too. I'm your host, Lo. Welcome to the Milk Making Minutes. On this first episode of the Milk Making Minutes, I'm so happy to be sharing my interview with my cousin, Danielle. As she is with everything in her life, she's authentic, she's funny, she's real, she shares the good and the bad and the hard, and her episode is such a joy to listen to. If you listen to this podcast and you feel like somebody else could feel supported and not so alone as they're feeding babies or as they're processing what it was like to feed babies, please share it with them. And one way you can really help the show is by rating and reviewing it in whichever podcasting app you listen to it on. That will go a long way in supporting me as I'm trying to get the show out to as many people as could be helped by listening to it.
My name is Danielle Calhoun. I'm mother of two boys. They're old now, older, 12, almost 13. And then I just had a son turn 11 this week. I live in Tampa, Florida with my husband and my kids. And I am a stay-at-home mom who also does about a billion different side hustles. But right now, my current occupation is ghostwriting a memoir.
Wow, so cool.
Me.
Yeah, and you've had a million side hustles and some not side hustles. You've gone in and out of side hustling and full-time work and side hustles that turned into full-time work over the years.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So
the joys of motherhood.
I know, right? Yeah. So I would love to just start out by telling us here on the Milk Making Minutes, what was your exposure to breastfeeding before you were pregnant, and before you thought about starting your own family? What exposure did you have?
I was actually just thinking about this morning in preparation for this call, and when I was 13, 14, I was the only child my whole life, and I was bottle fed baby. And when I was a teenager, my mom and dad split up, and then they got back together. And in their reunion, I got a little baby brother out of it. And she breastfed, I believe, out of necessity at the time. We were just an average lower income blue collar kind of household. And I think someone had given her a breast pump, and she does hair for a living. And I remember when my brother was born, that was like the first time I vividly recall having any experience with breastfeeding and pumping, because I thought that was like such a bizarre thing and must have like been so rough on her, because she was on her feet all day cutting hair and doing hair, and then she would go into the back closet where the color was to pump so that he would have milk at the daycare that he went to. That was my first experience.
Wow. And were you able to talk to her about, ask her questions or see what she was doing? Or was it just kind of, you knew it was happening?
It wasn't hidden or like I don't think I had any questions, because at that point, like, I understood the mechanics of it, because I was an older kid. I just knew that that's what she had to do. And I don't think I ever really was curious. I just thought it was just a part of the process, kind of a thing, a given.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for her, the decision was really about cost.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think
Yeah.
accessibility, because someone had given her a really nice pump,
Oh,
or
wow.
let her borrow it or something. I remember
Mhm.
it was like a big deal that she had it, that she had
Oh,
access
wow.
to it. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. How old's your brother now?
22, 23, 22, somewhere in there. I should know this. For sure.
Um, so then fast
Right.
forward to when you were deciding to have your own family, um, and you were pregnant. What were you thinking about when it came to feeding your own babies when you were pregnant? Were you thinking about it? Were you making decisions about how you were going to feed your babies? Were your providers talking about it? Were other people talking to you about it? Or was it not really something that was on your mind?
I think at that point in time, like in 1999, when my mom had my brother, um, it was becoming more popular, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I was born in the 80s, like they were just telling moms to just give them a bottle, right? Formula, which is
Mm-hmm.
fine. Everybody has a different way. But breastfeeding, I don't think was as popular, maybe as conventional per se.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So in 1999, it was less of a big deal. And then when I had my son in 2009, it was almost expected, I guess. Like, I didn't really think about, was I going to formula feed or breastfeed? I just knew that I was going to breastfeed, and if it didn't work, it didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And I was
But
just
you were
going to
at least
try.
going to try. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember my first son, he was born early, by like 2 weeks. He was small. And my childbirth experience with him was really, really not pleasant.
Mm.
And when I was trying to breastfeed him, I just felt like I just was doing it all wrong. Like, you're learning just
Mm.
like with any
Mm.
first baby. Um, and then with my second child, he was born a week late, and he was a big kid. And like, it felt like everything just fell into place so easily with him. And
Mm.
he was gaining weight at a rate that was totally different than my first son.
Mm.
Um, so I guess maybe once you know what to do, your body just takes over.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. So, so going back to that first pregnancy, then you just kind of knew you were going to try to
Yeah.
breastfeed. Did you have any goals around breastfeeding?
I remained pretty flexible
Mm-hmm.
because I was working full time and I was in a pretty um, strenuous job. I was a trainer for Coca-Cola and I had to travel.
Uh-huh.
So I was always sensitive to the fact that I might be sent to Canada for 2 weeks,
Mm-hmm.
or something like that. Thankfully, I traveled less once I had him, but I always remained kind of open to, we'll see how far we get with this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I want to say that I ended up breastfeeding him for probably the first 6 months exclusively. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then did you have a pump? Were you given a pump? Did you buy a
Yeah.
pump?
I bought
Okay.
a pump. Uh-huh.
Uh-huh.
And at the time, because of my role, it changed with my second son, but with my first son, because I was in a department that was always moving to different rooms, we had access to rooms.
Mm-hmm.
So it was never an issue for me to slip into an office and pump in between breaks
Mm-hmm.
or during training exercises and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I want to hear more about that, but I'd like to back up just a little bit. 'Cause you mentioned that your first son was born a couple weeks early. You were worried about birth weight and then weight gain. Can you give a quick synopsis, do you mind, on the birth experience and what impact you think that might have had on um, breastfeeding and your feeding experience with him?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my husband and I, is our first kid. Also, we're super young. We're 23 when we have our first son, and um, don't really know what the heck we're doing. We take the classes like that prepare you for birthing and stuff. And
Mm,
at the time, I know it sounds funny to say it now, but like in 2009, home birthing wasn't really quite as much of a trend as it is in 2022. Um,
mhm,
and I just knew that I was just going to have a regular birth, like in the hospital, medicated.
mhm,
And, but at the same time, even though I'd taken those classes, I still didn't feel fully prepared for what I experienced because um, I started having some Braxton Hicks contractions that last month. And the night before my son was born um, was really, really bad. And I ended up in the ER, and then they sent me back home.
mm,
Um, and I continued to labor at home until we went into the hospital. Um, and my doctor was, didn't really have the best, like, bedside manner, I guess you could say, in that it always felt kind of creepy. Like, does
mm.
that make sense? Like, your
Yeah.
intuition kind of gives you red flags a little bit.
Mhm,
Um, and I just labored and labored and labored for quite a while. And until finally he came in, and I had already had my epidural, and they had told me that, like, I think that it had worn off or something by the time that I delivered. I don't know if that's possible, but it
yeah.
felt like it.
Mhm,
And my son was sunny side up. I don't know what
mm,
the appropriate
mhm,
term for that is, but his head was like cut, stuck because his chin was up in the birthing canal. And so that's why he wasn't coming
mm,
out. And I was in so much pain that I didn't want anybody to touch me. I didn't want anything touching me. So I was like ripping off my gown, like, and telling my husband and my mom, like, just back off, just don't touch me. My husband's like literally passed out for a
mm,
second. My mom almost passed out because she hadn't eaten anything because it was just such a bad experience.
mhm,
And as soon as, so I was exposed, fully exposed whenever my son was born. And
mm,
um, as soon as he came out, um, and he wasn't like disconnected from the umbilical cord yet or anything like that, the nurse walked over and she covered my breast.
mm,
Like,
mhm,
uh, and I didn't understand like why. I was in a medical environment. I just had a baby. They were about to put the
mhm.
baby on me, like skin to skin. And um, it was just a bizarre experience. Yeah,
Yeah,
completely.
yeah, like, wow.
Yeah.
And so then ugh, what an experience.
And I
And so then
realized after the fact too that all of my OB/GYN appointments with that particular doctor, I never was given like a breast exam. So I don't know if
mm,
there was something going on like with him, or I don't know, but it was just a
mm,
weird thing. So um
mm,
yeah, I ended up switching after that.
mhm. Yeah, it's good to follow your intuition, and if you don't feel comfortable, make yourself comfortable moving forward.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so then were you able to then take your baby skin to skin
Hmm.
and okay.
Yes, I was.
And
Uh-huh.
and and how quickly did he feed
um
after? Do you remember all those years ago?
I know, right? He would be mortified if he knew we were talking about this right now. Um, he was like, it was pretty quick. Now my milk didn't come in, of course, right away, but he was ready to eat.
Uh-huh.
Um, it just wasn't quite working as fast as I would have liked it to, and that I didn't feel like I was feeding him anything.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. But he was latching and
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
doing all those things that babies instinctively do to get
Yeah.
milk coming in. Yeah. And did you, so I'm hearing that there was that experience with the nurse covering your breast there in the hospital, but then were there other nurses or lactation support provided to you right there in the hospital? What was that immediate time like at the hospital?
I do remember a nurse helping me get him latched on.
Hmm.
Um, I remember a lactation specialist coming into the room, but I think that was like after delivery, maybe.
Hmm.
Um, it was positive. It feels a bit like so far away. I'm trying to think for,
How fuzzy.
yeah. Hmm. But I mean, I wasn't without support. I'll say that
Hmm.
much. I
Hmm.
definitely was given resources to be able to handle business.
Hmm. And then, so that's in, how long did you stay at the hospital?
2 days.
2 days.
Yeah.
And it's
You and your husband and your baby at home. And then I happen to know you
Hmm.
personally, and I know your mom lived at the time very close to you. So you had
Yeah.
your mom's support. And then any other support that you had at home once you,
No, that was it. It was just my husband and my mom, which was helpful beyond belief.
I,
Um,
yeah,
it was harder breastfeeding um, because at first because I wasn't pumping, so there wasn't much my husband could do besides snore next to
right.
me.
Right, right. Yeah.
um, but I figured that out by the second kid.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. I know.
um, so
Yeah.
it was as positive as it could be for sure.
And I know you mentioned feeling concerned about weight gain. How long did you feel concerned about weight gain with your first?
The thing with my first son was that it wasn't necessarily that he was underweight. He was just
Mhm.
long and skinny. He was like
Mhm.
7.5 pounds or something.
Mhm.
And he was
He's
just a
still long and
long,
skinny.
yeah, he's just a long little baby. He just looks so like an alien with arms and legs.
Mhm. No.
Um, and um, he ended up gaining weight just fine.
Mhm.
I probably worked through those concerns within the first month.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And were you getting any, so when you were going to the pediatrician visits, was anybody else feeling concerned, or all those concerns were coming from internally?
No, no one else was feeling concerned. We had an amazing nurse practitioner at the time. She was actually mine before
Okay.
I had
Oh, wow.
kids, and she
Mhm.
was really good with the
Mhm.
kids, and
Mhm.
um, she took good care of us. And there was no concerns. He was colicky,
Uh-huh.
but
Oh.
other than that, which that in and of itself is enough,
Mhm.
um, we worked through that. I was going to say too, to add to that, on top of the fact that we were young and it was our first child, probably another contributing factor was the fact that we got married young and our marriage was a mess. And I think
Mhm.
subconsciously, I thought, like, let's have a baby, that'll fix everything. And
Mhm.
so adding the pressure of a new life and responsibility and sleep deprivation that comes with that
Mhm.
probably impacted that experience as well.
Right. And here you
Yeah.
are needing to do so much to feed your baby
Yeah.
with your partner snoring next to you.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure that was it's hard even in the best of partnerships
Right.
that aren't rocky. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. So then, and you can talk, I know we're focusing on that first
Uh-huh.
baby,
Yes.
um, but you have two children, and
I
you
do.
mentioned already that it felt so different with the
Yeah.
second. And sometimes it happens where the first is a piece of cake and then
Correct.
the second is harder.
Yeah,
And, with each child, depending on how many children you have, I
they're
know
all different.
people who have 7 children and they could not breastfeed the last 4. I know somebody who
Wow.
has, yeah, and she was fine with the first 3 and the last 4 she had to pump for.
Fascinating.
You just never know
For
what's
sure.
going to happen. But for you, and for me too, personally, my first was a super duper challenge, and my second was so much easier.
Yeah.
So, talk to me a little bit about the difference in how you felt going home with that first baby and feeding, and going home with that second baby and feeding, and what the difference was there,
Oh my
specifically
gosh.
related to breastfeeding.
Yeah, interesting, interesting. When my first son was born, I remember the first night we were in the hospital and he was in our room and he was crying. And I think he had just had like his meconium poop, like that big,
Mhm.
nasty, messy thing. And the
Mhm.
nurse came in to help us and clean him up and she walked away. And I looked at my husband and I said, they're literally gonna give us this kid and we're supposed to know what to do with him on our own.
Right.
And then I said, and think about all the people that don't have it as good as us that are handed off these little humans. And we just figure it out because
Yeah.
we've evolved to do that, right? Well, that's what we're
Right.
designed to do.
Right.
And I remember being so terrified of leaving the hospital with him. And then when my second came, I was like, my biggest concern was, how am I going to do this with 2?
Mhm.
Because my first son was 22 months when his brother was
Mhm.
born. And
Mhm.
I was so grief stricken about taking any time away from my first son by,
Mhm.
devoting it to the second. And I know that's probably every mom's concern, right? When they're
Right.
having more children. But with the second one, I was completely comfortable. The first one, I had like all these visitors came. The second one, I was like, I'm good. I don't need
Mm.
anybody to come up here. Like,
Mhm.
I just want some quiet because I know that all hell's going to break loose whenever I get home. Like,
Mhm.
so it was a totally different experience. He was like a little chunky thing and he was ready to eat and I knew what to do. And um, I, the birthing experience was night and day different. I have always said that had I had Eli, my second son, first, I would have had 18 billion kids thinking that they were all going to be that way
Mm.
because I think I pushed for maybe 30 minutes and he came right out.
Wow.
But I
And you had a different care provider that second
Yes,
time.
I
Mhm.
did. And I remember as soon as he came out, like I looked over at my husband and my best friend was in there photographing the birth and I like cracked a joke because my best friend doesn't have kids and she was petrified at what she was witnessing. So I was like really concerned about her. Um, and it all was very smooth. I had changed positions with Coca-Cola at the time, and at that point, I was not training anymore. I was at a desk job doing some price auditing, so lots of data entry, monotonous work, and it was at a different office that was not equipped. It was like an older office population.
Mm. Mhm.
Um, and I came back to work and they were not prepared. And they
Mm.
had to rig one of the telephone rooms at the time that people could take on their breaks to become a pump station. And the first day that I returned, I think I had to like pump in the bathroom because they were still working on it because they didn't know
Mm.
that I was going to need that.
Mm.
But then immediately following that, it seems like, it's nice to say like you're the first, but all these women were getting pregnant in that office and they were using that breastfeeding closet.
Wow. Yeah.
So I felt glad that I could help make that happen.
Yeah. And was it hard to ask for that for yourself, or did you feel like because it wasn't your first go around that you knew that you needed it and it wasn't as hard to ask?
It wasn't hard. What was frustrating was that it was the same company
Mm,
that did things two totally different ways, just in two different places. Like I worked for the same
Right.
yeah.
Coca-Cola, but
Mhm.
I had one experience in one office and then a totally kind of outdated, antiquated
Mm,
experience in the other
mm,
office.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, with either child, did you experience any pain breastfeeding or
I did
pumping?
it first.
Mhm.
Yeah, I did it first with my first son and maybe a little bit with the second one, but I don't feel like Eli's was as bad. Like, not to
Mhm.
the point of some of these other stories that I hear about people with like blisters and scabs and scrapes. I remember
Mhm.
being raw, um,
Mhm.
but I didn't have anything outside of that. I did get
Mhm.
mastitis, um,
Mm.
which that sucked.
Do you remember
Um,
when? At what point in your like how old was baby when you got mastitis?
I want to say that I got it with both of them.
Mhm.
I don't remember. I remember specifically getting it with my second because that's when I stopped breastfeeding. That story was I had breastfed him um, for 18 months.
Mhm.
Um, and part of that was formula mixed in when he was in daycare.
Mhm.
But I had gotten my wisdom teeth removed. Um,
Mm.
and I wasn't healing right. And I
Mm.
didn't realize at the time that I had a dry socket. So I was like in bed for what seemed like, I think maybe a week and a half, until finally I went back in and they fixed it. But because of that, um, my ducts got clogged. And so I
Mm.
was dealing with dry socket and mastitis. And
Oh no.
my husband was pretty much having to um, be dad for both of them and get my son into his crib because at the time he was in the bed and he couldn't
Mm.
have, and he was weaning him. um,
Mhm.
and it was a bit of a mess, but I remember that being really, really hard. Yeah.
Mm. Mhm. And so mastitis is a breast infection. How did you know that you had mastitis? What were the signs for you?
I knew because I had had it before with Aiden, my
Mhm.
firstborn,
Mhm.
and a part of my breast was hot
Mhm.
to the touch. And I called my doctor and they're like, yeah, let's get you situated.
Mhm.
And then I remember someone telling me to put like cabbage leaves
Mm.
on my breast. I don't know,
Mhm.
some maybe
Mhm.
wives' tale to dry me up.
Mhm.
Um, and I did, man, I did it all. Like you told me to do something, I'll do it all. Um, because I was just seeking relief.
Yeah.
Um,
So did you feel like you were probably felt like you were hit by a Mack truck, almost like a flu,
yeah. Yeah. On
fever,
top of
all of it.
the dry socket situation,
Right.
it was like a
Right.
double whammy for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And with your first, was it later on? How long? You said you breastfed your first for 6 months.
Yeah. He
Um,
didn't get it
ex-
as long.
uh-huh. And then what was that transition like? Um, from breast milk to formula at that time for you?
I feel like it was relatively seamless simply because there was no other option because he was in daycare and I
Mhm.
was drying up because I was working so much and kind of in
Mm.
a stressful role,
Mhm.
that he just wasn't getting what he needed. So it was an easy move. Plus, he was already being introduced to solids.
Mm.
So
Mhm.
it was relatively smooth with the exception of he spit up a lot.
Mm. Mhm.
They suspected that he was lactose intolerant, so we had to like work out like what formulas were good for him, um,
Mhm.
and that was a bit tricky, but we got it nailed
Mhm.
down.
And so when you made the decision to start introducing formula, were you stressed about your milk production at that time? I mean, because obviously you were trying to pump at work and probably you weren't producing what he was taking at daycare. So you were then looking for formulas to introduce to him. Was that stressful at that time? And can you tell us a little bit about what your pumping schedule was like? And
hmm
um,
I would get to work around 8 o'clock. And typically there was a break at like 10:30, and then there was lunch, and then there was another break around 3.
mm,
And I would pump on those breaks
mhm,
in between. And then we had I'm trying to remember how I stored it. I think I had a cooler at the
mm,
time,
mhm,
that I just made sure to put all my pumped milk in the cooler,
yeah,
and then take it home. I was stressed about the transition with the first one because it was pretty painful.
mm,
Um, but it it was relatively seamless just because I think it needed to be because I
mhm,
was just so busy with work and trying to
mhm,
also keep him
mhm.
going in a healthy direction.
Yeah. So
So
you were not putting pressure on yourself to feel like I have to provide breast milk exclusively to my baby, and if I don't,
no,
then I'm okay.
I never felt
Yeah.
that with either of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Eli
you
just got
just
lucky.
yeah. 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 And yeah, so then what you made that transition, but with Aiden, did the mastitis happen at that transition point when
I
you
think it
were
happened before that actually,
okay.
because
Okay.
I remember the nurse practitioner at the time had encouraged me to take fenugreek
Mhm.
to help re-up my milk supply production, I
Mm.
guess.
Mhm.
And I remember that being like a weird experience because it was kind of stinky, but
Mm.
um,
Okay.
yeah.
Great. I'd like to know what was the worst advice that you were given about breastfeeding.
So I can't remember any advice, but I definitely had a bad experience that like left a sour taste in my mouth for quite a while.
All
Um,
right, let's hear it.
I was at a family function, and we were sitting around, and at the time it wasn't popular to or accepted to publicly breastfeed. Um, and I just wanted to be a part of the conversation, and I was completely concealed and covered. And we were just having a good time. And as soon as I went to breastfeed my son, mind you, nothing is exposed, nothing, no reason to fuss. Um, the two men that were a part of the conversation kind of made like a awkward haha like poke fun situation, and then
Mm.
they very clearly stepped away to give me privacy, which I just
Yeah.
found very funny. I know,
Yeah.
I'm sure their intentions were good, but years later, several women in our family have children now, and they were doing the same thing in social environments, and it was totally accepted,
Right.
because now it's more popular. But what was frustrating was that I felt like I had to be the guinea pig
Right. It's
and
hard
get
being the
like that
first.
kind of yeah, get the
Yeah.
response.
Right.
So that always kind of irked me a little, but
Yeah, it actually makes you feel worse that they felt like they had to step away, not,
yeah,
you know, they thought they were doing a nice thing, but actually what I'm doing here is nothing you need to step away from.
right, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And what about best advice or best experience? Either one.
The best advice I was ever given was actually from your sister. She had a baby a year before me, and she was also a working mom. She was a nurse, and she encouraged me to pump in between feedings from nearly the start, so that I could build up a breast milk supply and freeze it. Um, so that I wouldn't have to be so dependent on breastfeeding from breast exclusively whenever I was leading up to the work transition.
Mhm.
And it was a game changer to me completely.
Mm.
It gave me like nights. I had my nights back where I could sleep. My husband could feed the baby sometimes. Like it
Mhm.
was very helpful.
Mhm. It allowed you to get to that 6-month
Yeah.
mark. Yeah,
Right.
that first. Yeah, and then what a difference, 6 months with the first and 18 months with the second.
Yeah.
Um,
Big
you
time.
know, yeah, just having that experience under your belt and
For sure.
what a difference. What was the difference you were working between the first and the second? Was it the same?
Um, the first I was working like 8 to 5:30, and the second, oh, that was 5 days a week. And then the second I was working 4 10s. So I was working like
Mm.
7 to 5, I want to say, for 4 days, and then I had a day off.
Mm.
Yeah, it was nice.
Yeah, interesting. And so, were there any resources that really helped you to either meet your breastfeeding goals or feel good about adjusting the goals, like either online or I know you mentioned that advice that my sister gave you. Any other resources? I know, back in 2009, maybe there weren't as many online resources, but anything
I
that
don't
you turned.
remember. Yeah, no, I don't remember having anything particular to go by.
Okay. Cool. And then, is there anywhere that people can connect with you, find you, that if they wanted to, after all my millions of followers, listen to this podcast?
I guess on Instagram.
Uh
Uh, at
huh.
I don't even know my Instagram handle. That's how frequently I'm on it. Danielle in Calhoun, I think is what it is, maybe. Yeah.
Cool. All right, we'll put it in the show notes once
There
I
we
figure out
go.
how to do that.
I started the Milk Making Minutes because I'm passionate about supporting breastfeeding people. But more importantly, I knew that hearing real people tell real stories would benefit both the storytellers and the listeners. I had this idea for 3 years before I launched. I asked so many people how I should begin, and Anchor came up repeatedly as the easiest way to launch a podcast. And I have not been disappointed. If you are passionate about a topic and have wanted to start a podcast, you can use Anchor to record and distribute your podcast. It's easy to use. You can use the editing tools right from the platform. You can distribute your podcast episodes seamlessly to listening platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts right from Anchor. And the best part is, it's free. And the tech support has been great too. Go to anchor.fm or download the app right to your phone to get started on your great podcast idea. Thank you so much for listening to the Milk Making Minutes. I hope you found connection and feel supported wherever you are in your baby feeding journey. The views expressed in each interview are deeply personal and sacred, and I'm so grateful to each person who is generous enough to share their story. It is also true that those views are solely theirs and do not necessarily reflect my opinion or advice as a lactation supporter, and this podcast does not qualify as medical advice. If you are struggling to feed your baby, please seek out the support of a local IBCLC.